Well, it's a great day for me. Get to build some furniture today, and that's what I love doing. In particular today, I'm going to be building two bookshelves. One of them is going into the house and is a design that my wife has chosen. The other one's going into this room over here, which is my office next to the shop, and that's a design that I've chosen. I've been thinking a little bit about what motivates us in picking our various furniture styles. And I've come up with an analogy, just bear with me for a minute. Think back to that first car that you bought. Maybe you were in high school, you didn't have a lot of money, and you just needed something to get you around town. Well, I'm thinking about that 150,000 mile plus hatchback. Maybe it's in a color that's gone out of style a few years ago. It's going to get you from place to place, but you know that if you use it a little too hard, it maybe is not so reliable. I think that's how we start with bookshelves too. Think of your particle board bookshelf that you get from the box store. You know what I'm talking about. You're going to set it up in a dorm room in college, and it's going to hold your books for a while. But you know if you move it around a little too much, it's just not going to last. I think you move on from there, and you get to a point in your life, maybe you have a more stable income, but you also have more basic needs. You have a family that you need to put in there. So I'm thinking more like your SUV, the kind of thing that you'd buy on a lot, used or new, but with fewer miles. This is your reliable car that's going to get you around. You're going to use it and not even think about it. It's just going to sit there. Bookshelves can be like that too. This is the kind of thing you pick up from a furniture store. It's got three sides to it with an open face, adjustable shelves. You're going to set it in your office. You're going to use it and you're just not going to worry about it. It's going to look fine. But then you get on with your life a little bit more and you want something a little fancier. You're going through that midlife crisis and that Mustang convertible just looks like that's the car for you. Well, that's the kind of bookshelf I think that we're building for the house. It's the kind of thing that you could still find at a furniture shop, but it's not going to be your standard thing. It's got a little more style to it, but it's still going to be practical and usable. And then there's the people that go just a little step further. These are the car enthusiasts that just want to try something new. Right now that might be those people who are really into those cyber trucks that are coming out. Or maybe they're like, 4 wheels is not necessary, we can get by with 3, and they're looking at the slingshot. That's the kind of bookshelf that I'm thinking about for my office here. Maybe a little impractical, probably not the kind of thing you'll see a standard furniture shop making, but it'll be fun to build. So I hope you enjoy watching me make it. I know I'm going to enjoy making it. Let's get to it. The frames of the bookshelves are going to be made out of walnut. And so I went to the hardwood store and I bought some 6'4" or 1.5" rough milled walnut. And the first job is to cut them down and to mill them into the appropriate sizes. I'm working from a cut sheet in this particular build, so I cut them down to length first, and then I run them through the jointer to get 2 sides flat and square. The thickness of the material I'm going to use is 1 inch in its finished dimensions. It started out at 6'4", lost a little bit on the jointer, and I'm bringing it down to that 1 inch using my thickness planer. I record the intro to these videos before I do any of the building, and after I had recorded them and while I was starting to make them, I wanted to differentiate between the two bookshelves, and so I came up with code names for them. The one that was going in the house I called the Mustang, and the one that was going into my office I called the Slingshot. Now both the Mustang and the Slingshot need these longer posts in the front that will make up the front frame, and that's what I cut originally. With the shorter pieces, they will only be used by the Slingshot version, and they're going to make up the structure at the back. It is those back pieces that I'm cutting out now. They're 1 inch thick and 2 inches wide, and right now I'm cutting them a little over length because these square cuts are not going to be the final dimension. One of the advantages of using a cut list is that you can start from the larger pieces and work your way down. And here, if you end up with a little bit of extra wood, you can just consult your list, see what the smaller pieces may be, and try and get that out of the leftovers from a longer stick. In this case, I'm cutting off 2 of the feet that are going to be used for Slingshot. The supports for the shelves underneath the two bookshelves were supposed to be the same. But kind of last minute I decided that there was a piece that wasn't strictly necessary. I was going to put it on the slingshot model, but not on the Mustang. And so I needed to only cut 5 of these. There's going to be 5 shelves each instead of 10. I didn't quite think through all the implications of that, and you'll see that this decision does catch up to me a little bit later. Also, you need to be a little bit careful as you're making a lot of cuts that you don't do something unsafe. I almost went to cut there without a good handle on the piece of wood that I was cutting until I realized just before I turned the saw on and turned it all around. So watch out. And here are the materials all ready for assembly. The first glue up is for the back portion that is going to hold the shelves on the slingshot model. This is that piece that I told you I had originally designed into both bookshelves, but decided to take away from the Mustang version at the last minute. The top shelf in both models is actually going to be hung upside down, and so I have one piece that's a little bit lengthier than the others. Once the pieces were glued on, a little bit of sanding brought them back into plane with each other. Now this is an original design that I'm making on this bookshelf, and here I'm taking the slingshot back framing members and I'm running them through to round over the edge. And I will realize not long after this that this is also a mistake. It's not a crippling mistake, but it will catch up to me. The back frame of the slingshot model is going to be made up of these pieces that are cut as a palindrome. And first I take all 10 pieces and I cut a 30-degree cut into the end. I then take one of the pieces and carefully measure the length and cut it out, and that's what I have here. I'm then using a clamp system that I built into my miter station to match the length of the first piece that I cut. I can then take all of the other cuts and put them in and make sure that they come out at the exact same length as well. The support pieces under the shelves only need one side cut at the 30-degree angle, and so I'm using the same technique, but this time with a square block and butting each one of the pieces up to it to make sure all the lengths come out the same. All right, so I just finished cutting out these pieces, these thicker, longer ones, and these thinner, smaller ones. Both of them are at 30-degree cuts, or 60, depending how you look at it. And now it's possible that some future version of me has put a thumbnail into this video so you know how this bookshelf is going to look, but I haven't seen it yet, so don't spoil it for me, and I'm going to talk you through how I'm going to build it. In the back of the bookshelf, it's going to have this lattice structure that's done in X's. And those X's are going to be made by overlapping these two. If I put them like that, I should be able to cut a half-lap joint in the middle there. There's going to be a lot of pressure on that joint, but there's also quite a bit of surface area, so I think it's going to be plenty strong. Then at the base and top of these, they will connect into these pieces here. The shelf will then sit on top of that, and these smaller pieces will come out as supports for the shelf, running into long vertical posts in the front, which are these longer pieces I've cut out over here. I really like the design. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to put it together though. To attach the larger pieces into this shelf holder, no problem. I can use these big Dominos and they'll provide quite a bit of strength. The trick though is going to be these smaller pieces. They're only 1 inch by 3/4 inches, and this is the smallest domino I have. I'm going to do what I can to see if I can fit it in there without any error, and hopefully it'll work just fine. If not, I'll fall back into dowels, which will be fine too. It's just that the dowels allow a little bit of rotating while it's being glued up, which I like to avoid. Anyway, I like the design. I like how the pieces have come out so far, and I think it's going to be a fun and challenging build to put together. You haven't seen that part yet, so here we go. The first step is to create the half-lap joint, and to do that I need to cut through halfway in the middle of each of these pieces at a 30-degree angle opposite to the ones at the end. I used the same technique as before, but I put stop blocks on both sides this time. The miter saw leaves some grooves behind in its cuts, and so using a hand plane that has a blade that spans across the entire plane, I just whittled down the edges that are sticking up. The aim here is to have as tight of a joint as possible. And with this first one, it was so tight I needed a hammer to get it together, and so the friction was able to hold it while the glue set. With a few of the others, it was a little looser, and I had to use clamps to hold them together while it dried. I'm using this adjustable square to mark the places where I'm going to cut out the domino holes, both on the straight pieces and on the top and bottom of the X's. It's then just a matter of taking the domino cutter itself and going around to all four sides on the straight pieces and all four endpoints on the X's. Up to this point, we've been neglecting poor old Mustang, and it's time to turn our attention over to her. Now, we haven't been doing any work there because Mustang's a much more simple design, as I mentioned in the beginning. The back doesn't have a complicated pattern at all. In fact, it's just this rectangular slab. The slab, though, is wider than I could find a board, and so I'm going to have to connect these two pieces together. I'm going to do that with dominoes, so I've marked at regular intervals along the edge where I'm going to put those slots in for the dominoes, and I started cutting them out on both pieces. The point of the dominoes here is just to help me when I'm doing the glue up, so that one piece won't bow out above another, and I'll be able to just use a little bit of sanding to make sure it all stays in line. That light bit of wood that's on the thinner piece on the right, that bit of wood is called sapwood. And in walnut it has a lighter color than the rest and less grain. Now you can see that that bit of wood is going to be inside the joint. That's a style choice I made. And having seen the final piece, it's debatable whether that was the right choice or not. It gives it some interest, but also sometimes it might be nicer to just keep the grain together and have that sapwood be something you see on the outside, if not cut off completely. With enough glue, enough pressure, and a little bit of time, that board's actually all ready to go. Much faster than its cousin, Slingshot. While the glue dries on Mustang, I'm turning my attention now to these support pieces. These are the 1" by 3/4" pieces that take the tiny domino. And I'm just going one at a time and cutting the dominoes into the ends of them. There are 20 of them in total. For Slingshot, I had to add 2 of the little dominoes to the pieces that were going to make up the backbone that already had 4 of the larger dominoes in them that connect to the X's. The glue was all dried, and so I took all of the clamps that were holding Mustang's back together. And I did a first pass using a hand plane just to knock off the glue and just make that ridge come down a little. But then it needed a sanding as well. The surface needed it anyways, and so I went from 80 to 120 to 220 grit. I set Mustang aside and I turned my attention back to Slingshot. Now that all of the pieces of the back frame had their mortises cut into them, I could glue them up with the dominoes. And I'm going to do this in 2 sections. First, I'm going to take 2 of the X's, glue them up with the straight member pieces they connect to, and then I'll let that dry. Once those 2 sections are set up, I can go back with the other X's and finish it off in one straight piece. You'll see that I'm also clamping it to the table as I go. This helps keep the whole piece straight. The shelves will be attached in both cases using rivet nuts and bolts that go through these members supporting the shelves. A smaller bit is used to allow the bolts to pass through, and a larger bit is countersunk a little bit so that the heads won't be seen. Over the course of the build, I ended up using 4 different techniques for attaching these shelf supports on. This first one is glue, using these glued on cauls to clamp them down, and then I would tear those cauls off. That was a little bit cumbersome, so I switched my techniques a bit, and I just used a combination of wood glue and CA glue to hold them down while the glue dried. I unfortunately lost the third technique due to a video technical error, and the fourth technique you'll see later. Next, I had to prepare the other side of the shelf supports, which meant drilling some mortise holes in and using a special attachment to the domino machine so that it could slide down and center these just perfectly. Now, I've been putting off doing the shelves themselves, but I did have the lumber for them. In this case, I'm using maple as a contrasting color, and we have to do the same things that we did with the walnut, namely milling them up by using the jointer and the planer. There's going to be 10 shelves in total, and each shelf needs 2 pieces glued up together to make it 12 inches wide. Here is that glue up. I'm able to get 6 done at a time on my assembly table. I need 10 total. So this is going to be the first batch, which I end up leaving overnight, and I will come back and do 4 more. A lingering question from earlier is whether I was going to trust those little joints with the small dominoes, and the answer is no. I ended up having to find a way on both Slingshot and Mustang to get screws into them to hold them into the back pieces. I wanted to get some finish applied before I attached the shelves, and so I took a little bit of time now to apply a hard wax finish to both Slingshot and to Mustang. The shelves were a little oversized on purpose, so now I'm going to clean them up. I actually first took them through the planer to get them all to the same thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Then I made the length the right size over here on the miter saw, and I ripped them down as well on the table saw to get their depth all to the same place. I have been reliably informed that good sanders use the technique of putting a pencil mark across the surfaces that they're going to sand in order to make sure that they get good coverage on everything. And to be a good sander, I showed that here. But honestly, there are 10 of these shelves with 2 sides each and 3 different grits on all of them, and this ended up being the only time I used the pencil. I guess I still have some patience to learn. Both the frames were assembled, and I went to dry fit in one of the shelves, and that happened. The shelf fit into one of the frames, but not the other. Specifically, it worked on Slingshot because of that back piece there that you'll recall I took away from Mustang, and so now I'm going to have to cut half of the shelves down to fit. And here comes dry fit number 2. The frames are just behind the table saw, and that one didn't fit either, which means I had mismarked it one more time. I didn't believe it. I tried to go through the side as though that might change it from going from the front, but I had to take a 1/4 inch more down and make one more rip. After doing this second cut, it fit just fine, so I repeated it for 4 more shelves. To mark the locations where I needed to drill in for the rivet nuts, I just took a drill into the existing holes after clamping the shelves on and put a little dimple into the shelf. I could then take that dimple over to the drill press, and it would self-center as long as I got close enough, and I would drill a hole 1/4 inch radius and 1/2 inch down. The rivet nuts themselves were installed with the application of just a little force. You saw me earlier strengthen the connections of the shelf supports to the back of the frame. The only way I could think to do this to the front of the frame was to get these black angle brackets, which I screwed pilot holes for and then screwed the brackets themselves into both the frame and the support member. The shelves were then attached by screwing in these bolts through the 4 holes that I had drilled earlier. Well, we're all finished. We've got the Mustang and we have the Slingshot. And I'm personally partial to the Slingshot style. It's the one I had designed for me in the beginning. But I'd love to hear your opinion about these as well. Which one do you prefer? I have to admit that this might be considered like a 76 Mustang. It kind of has the modern retro style to it. If you wanted to do something a little more contemporary, I think you could make it in exactly the same way. Maybe substitute the walnut out for maple instead and paint it black. That would give you more of the modern farmhouse style. And that look is very popular right now. If you made it this far, also, I think you might enjoy subscribing to the channel. This is the kind of thing I like to make, and it's the kind of thing I'll make videos about. I'd like to go over a little bit of what went well with this build and what maybe could have had some improvements, but to do that, we have to come up for a little bit of a closer look. The first thing to note is I would not change a thing about these shelves. I love the finish on them. I love their size. I love the color and its contrast with the walnut. I even love this connection system here, where I can take the shelves out or I can secure them from underneath. I did change something about them though from my original design. I had originally designed them to be 1 inch thick, and these are 3/4. I actually like the 3/4. I think it looks sleek. However, it had an unintended consequence. This backbone piece right here was designed to be level with the top of the shelf, but because the shelf became thinner, this now sticks up 1/4 of an inch. And so my design to just have the X showing didn't really come through. The other part about this backbone here is that because I did this round over before I did this crosslap halflap joint, it means that I have a little bit of a gap where they come together on the surface. And then that looks a little bit unintentional and unplanned. Don't like that completely. But the real problem is underneath. These stiles that hold up the shelf, they just aren't thick enough. They're thick enough to be strong enough to hold it, but they're not thick enough to have a strong enough joint here at the ends, just through a regular tenon and glue system. Because of that, I had to add this screw on this side, and that's not a big deal. From the outside, you can't see it with the shelf in place, here or above, where I've got this one hanging. However, on this side where I have the angle brackets, it's a bit of an eyesore. And I really think that that should be changed. To do that, all you have to do is make this a little bit thicker. It's 3/4 of an inch right now. I think 1.25 inches would allow you to get a little bit bigger of a tenon and enough surface area there that you could glue it up and it would be just fine without the additional support. So while I love this bookshelf, and I'd love to have it inside my office, there are just enough mistakes here that I'm not quite satisfied with it. And so I think, let's do it again. To prepare my materials, I had to repeat a lot of work, but I won't make you watch that again. There are, however, some things that I did a little differently. Also, if we're going to do this again, why don't we have some background music with a little more pop? So the first thing that I'm going to do differently is that when I cut out the material for those half-lap joints, I'm not going to do it on the miter saw. I'm going to do it using the dado stack on my table saw. And in order to do that, I have to build a new sled. So I start out by making what would be a normal cross-cut sled, only it's tuned to take the dado slot and it doesn't cut all the way through. I screwed in a piece of plywood that I had cut at 30 degrees on the miter saw, and then with 4 simple passes I was able to line up and cut out the half lap on each of the pieces. The glue up of the backbone was similar but a little bit different. If you'll notice, I do not have those little back pieces that will hold the shelf up here. I'm trying to do the entire thing in one single plane. Because I didn't do the round over of these member pieces, the joints fit together much more tightly, but there were some cases where there was a little gap. And so I'm using a technique here where you add some glue and some sawdust to those little gaps and then sand it all back down again, and it looks like there's no gap at all. I did still want the round over look, so this time I used a handheld router and I went around all of the edges and inside all of the triangles and got the same look without it overlapping on the joints. I lined the post up with the back and used the shelf supports themselves to find out where I was going to cut the domino holes. And then I was able to use the pieces themselves to mark across all 10 pieces where the dominoes would go on the shelf supports. I'm not going to use a domino at all on the angled end of these shelf supports. Instead, I'm just going to screw them in. And so I'm making 2 passes. With this jig, I'm first using a smaller bit that will take the shank of the nail, and then I'm countersinking a bit for the head on this as well. Using this technique allowed me to use my 4th glue-up method. In this case, I'm actually gluing the supports to the posts on the front, rather than attaching them to the back first. This allowed me to square them up and make them straight and do the entire set all at once. With all of them together and all of them squared up using these templates, I could go back and do the other end simply using screws with no glue at all. The back shelf supports are still part of the design. The glue on is the same as before, it just comes a little bit later in the process. Once the glue was dry, I was able to use these screws to connect all of the shelf supports to the back of this bookshelf, which I have codenamed Catapult. The finish was applied just like before, putting on 2 coats and then wiping it off. And the same technique was applied to the shelves. At the very end, I took a 500 grit sandpaper and lightly, just by hand, knocked off any of the ridges to make sure the whole thing was smooth. I assembled the whole thing on the horizontal here on my assembly table, and then with a little grunt work, I was able to stand it up. My face isn't turning red. Your face is turning red. Well, here you go. Project Catapult has now joined Project Slingshot. And I'm not even sure if it's visible from the camera here what the differences are between the two. But I can tell. No more gap in the cross members on the X's. The bracing holding the shelves up is much stronger. And not only that, it was quite a bit easier to build the second time around. It's kind of amazing how much you can learn just doing a second iteration. I'm going to end up using both of these. This one will stay here in my office, here in the shop, and I think this one has a home inside the house. So I'm happy that I did both of them. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you'll join me on the next one.